Hello, and welcome to Spectrum. If this is your first time listening to us, then Spectrum is all about gender, how gender shapes you, where there are stereotypes, and how we can achieve equality. This series is about sex and love. They're such central aspects of human life that we wanted to find out about whether or not they're affected by gender. Do women experience love differently? Do men experience sex in a different way from women? I will be taking a look at different religious perspectives on this issue. I have interviewed people from Judaism, Sikhism, Christianity and Hinduism, as well as a producer from the Religious and Ethics Department at the BBC, to tie it all together for us. My choice of interviews has been limited by time and availability, but I've not been intentionally biased when it comes to selecting different faith groups. If you identify with a particular faith group yourself, or as atheist or agnostic, then we would love to hear from you about your perspective on sex and love. You can email us with your thoughts on spectrumradio101@gmail.com, or find us on Facebook and drop us a soundbite at any time. First up, I interviewed Claire, who is an Anglican priest, as well as being the producer and presenter of the daily service on Radio 4, and producer of Sunday Worship and Choral Evensong. So, firstly, could you tell me a little bit about your faith? What are the central ideas and beliefs?
I'm a Christian. I believe in God and that Jesus Christ is his Son, whatever that means, and that the Holy Spirit is present in the people of God now.
And is there a central holy text?
The Bible.
And what stance does this take on love? Does it stipulate rules about marriage, who you can marry or who you can love?
It depends how you view the Bible. I mean, the Bible has a record of all different kinds of marriage and love. So there are stories in the Bible of people who are married to one husband with several wives. There are stories of people with concubines. There are stories of people who are married one man, one wife. And there are stories of intense friendships between men and women.
So you think it's possible perhaps to interpret the Bible differently?
Yes.
Does Christianity as a whole, or do different denominations within Christianity take a stance on gay marriage?
I think there is a huge variety of opinions, and it depends whether you're talking about the official line that's agreed by the church as a body and what people think, the ordinary community thinks, and I would hope that the two would interact and rub off on each other.
What is the official stance that is taken?
The official stance is that God welcomes and loves everyone, whatever their gender or sexuality. In terms of marriage, the Church of England, which I belong to, says that marriage is between one man and one woman, although they accept civil partnerships, and I do know of churches where civil partnerships are blessed, where there are services that honour those relationships.
Do you think that when it comes to love, there is a gender difference in any way? Is it stricter for men or for women?
No.
And how is sex viewed within Christianity? Again, there may be differences of opinion, but...
There are differences of opinion, and in some ways, mine's a personal view, which I hope would reflect what the church's view is, but that sex is a gift of God that's about intimacy of relationship between people. It's about connected with being faithful and loyal to the other partner, and for some parts of the Christian church it's important that it's within a married relationship, although it depends what you mean by that committed relationship.
So are there times when sex can be a good thing and times when it can be a sin?
Difficult really, because it's not sex in itself, it's about the relationship. So the relationship is not life enhancing for the two people, then it's a bad thing, but it's not because sex itself is a bad thing, it's because of the way sex is being used or abused. So if it should be mutual and about fullness and joy in life, not about dominance of one person over another or cruelty or exploitation.
And again, do you think that there is in any way a gender difference within Christianity when it comes to sex, or is it equal to both genders?
I believe it's equal to both genders, but culturally there are situations where people see that there is a different role or a complementary role between men and women in that relationship. And it particularly would be in heterosexual relationships. That particular stance in the church would view the male as the head of the family, and I suppose in some senses that has a relation to the sexual relationship.
Do you think it's changed historically as well? Do you think there's kind of been a shift in attitude over time?
I'm sure that's the case because religion operates within a culture, and I think trying to differentiate between culture and between what the faith actually teaches is very hard to pull apart, because Christianity is an incarnational religion. It's about living your faith in the flesh. Then, inevitably that's going to get woven in.
And there are some, what are sometimes seen as almost modern challenges, like the LGBTQ plus movement has kind of developed, people coming out as transgender, talking about that more. Do you think Christianity has embraced those people? Do you think there are any tensions?
I suppose, by definition, a lot of Christian communities are conservative with a small c.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always surprised me within congregations, first of all, how behind people are in knowing what's going on in the world outside. But also, how accepting. I mean, I know congregations where people who've been brought up in those congregations who are certainly lesbian and gay. I don't know that I personally know any transgender people. Because they're part of the Christian family and been brought up in that, it's just perfectly acceptable, and it's not a political or worrying issue at all. But I think it's sometimes a challenge to congregations to actually have their eyes opened as to what they are actually doing.
Final question. Do you think that sex and love are considered important issues within Christianity?
Yes, because, as I was saying, it's an enfleshed religion. It's about human relationships and about what gives humans their, I suppose it's what Jesus said, I came to give them life and life in all its fullness. And I believe that's part of the fullness of life. Not necessarily for everybody, but certainly for a lot of people.
Thank you, Claire, for taking the time to let Spectrum interview you. It is clear that there are many differences within the Christian faith, that people have interpreted the Bible differently, and that the cultural legacy of Christianity should be studied separately from the Bible itself. This may in part be because Christianity is such an ancient religion, and it has evolved so much over time. By contrast, Sikhism is a relatively new religion, and so is very different from Christianity in many ways. I interviewed Cully to find out more. Cully is a development producer for BBC Media City, and he kindly took the time to tell us more about Sikhism. Okay, so Cully, can you tell me what your faith is and what the central ideas and beliefs are?
Absolutely, yes. My faith is Sikhism. I'm a Sikh, and it is a relatively new religion in contrast to the world religions. It's been around since 1469, and it believes in the same thing as most religions do, basically, in terms of one God. It's a monotheist religion. The reason why it came around basically was in India, where it originated at that point. The main religions were Islam and Hinduism, and different sort of versions of what they are now, basically. So there's lots of idol worship, lots of conversions, and there was the sort of essence of religion was lost. And there were 10 teachers. Started off with the first teacher, Guru Nanak, in 1469, who decided to clarify basically what religion is meant to be about, basically, and get rid of a lot of the things people got caught up in terms of the caste system and the inequality around India at that time. So he was a human teacher. He was a teacher basically who taught this new way of life, and so that's what Guru means. Guru means teacher. And then and they carried on with 10 more teachers after him. So over a span of a couple of centuries, the philosophy of Sikhism began to evolve, and those 10 teachers basically put together this very straightforward way of living your life that wasn't about conversions and it wasn't about idol worship. It was about one God and praise for that God in terms of the more simplistic approach. It also had the very essence of equality in terms of caste system. The system basically was telling you what you should be born into and die as part of your labours and so forth, as well as gender equality. So that's where it started.
And you mentioned 10 teachers. Did they put together a central holy text? Is there a central text within
There is,
Sikhism?
yes. The first Guru, Nanak, wrote a lot of poetry and wrote a lot of prayers, but it wasn't compiled into a book, and it wasn't said to be the word of God, as other texts are. this basically is a compilation of poetry, of hymns, of people writing stories that would help people to live their lives basically, and have a bit more of an understanding of what life should be about. Poetry also wasn't just about the 10 Sikh gurus basically who wrote it. It's also poetry compiled from Islamic poets and Hindu poets as well. So in its text, it's a mixture of different teachings and poetry and hymns.
What stance does your religion take on love and marriage? Does it stipulate rules for marriage or who you can marry?
It's quite vague in terms of there isn't any specific codes of conduct in that sense. A marriage is meant to be a union of souls, and that's about it. There isn't any mention equality in that sense in terms of gender equality, in terms of sexuality. And certainly because it has equality in terms of women and men as its tenets of the faith, it doesn't stipulate basically that men are the ones that have to choose and so forth, or women are more subservient. That certainly is in its raw form in terms of what the religion started off with. As with every idea basically over centuries, it slightly gets misinterpreted, and depending on who's in power and to what sort of organisation that is looking at religion, they decide to put extra rules on. But it's unfortunate that that's the case, but there isn't any doctrines or any rules basically about Sikhism as a faith in terms of who you can and can't marry.
But it started out being very equal in terms of the genders.
Yes, it did, absolutely. Yeah. And that's, I mean, it continued throughout the process in terms of one thing that women can lead congregations and they can fought in the Sikh wars and so forth, so they've been in the front line. Women have been equal throughout, with men, across Sikhism historically. And even in Britain here, basically, women lead prayers all the time in places of worship. There is a real strength in Sikh women. So that's the one thing that has stood the test of time. The difference is that the sort of cultural understanding behind it sometimes is people of Asian heritage, and certainly from India as a country as opposed to religion, still have this sort of subservient sort of nature, basically, of women being more domestic. That is a cultural thing, not a religious thing.
Okay, so there's a difference between the culture of Sikhism and the religion.
So the difference between the culture of British Indians and Asians who immigrated from India, whether they be Sikh, Hindu or Muslim, who have come across basically this general idea of what women have done in the past in terms of rural and or even possibly cities in India, basically, and brought that across with them. But that doesn't have anything to do with the religion, and sometimes it is confused between the two. The religion does stipulate basically that there is no difference basically, and that absolutely equal in every right. So that should be held up a lot more than it is.
And when it comes to sex as well, what is your religion's stance? Does it take quite a strict stance?
There isn't, I mean, again, it depends on the interpretations and who's interpreting them. There isn't a huge amount about doctrine around sex either. It can be a bit controversial, only because there were texts written by the 10th Guru. Sikhism started off as a very peaceful religion, and on the 10th Guru, basically, at that time, there was a huge amount of war being fought, and Sikhism was almost eroded twice in its history. So he took up the sword, basically, took up arms. Well, it was done before that, basically, but he was the most famous of the warriors. And at that point, it was a very different time, and he wrote poetry that wasn't in the Holy Book of Guru Granth Sahib, and that does talk about sex, and it does talk about it in terms of at a time of war. It's a very different interpretation of what sex is seen as, basically, in Sikhism as a whole. But if you read around Sikhism as well as the actual Holy Book itself, it isn't a very strict doctrine of what we should be doing. Basically, there's a lot more openness to it. But those other texts don't get read as much. It becomes a lot more about sex is about procreation and is within the marriage, and that's what it seems to have been sort of taught afterwards, basically. But that isn't necessarily what's written in the Guru Granth Sahib.
And again, is there a gendered difference when it comes to sex? Is it directed for men or for women, or is there a sense of equality again?
No, well, exactly. I mean, there's a difference again between the cultural and religion. So religion, basically, because it doesn't talk about it in a very open sense, and it's not something that's talked about often, basically, it's open to interpretation, and that's a problem where now it becomes a lot more about women are seen as more sexually active than they are looked down upon almost. But that's again a cultural thing, and something that India is still going through many centuries later now. Where on a week-to-week basis we're seeing huge amounts of stories coming across from India about the sort of huge gender gap in terms of sexuality, in terms of how sexual women can be. They talk about what they dress like still, basically, which is still shocking at this stage, basically, but what they dress like if they could go out and if they drink, basically, are they bringing it on themselves and so forth. And it's an absolutely atrocious sort of understanding, but people need to go to that cultural understanding now to understand that there is no difference to talk about how men approach sex and how women approach sex, but that's going to take a very long time. But those cultural understandings have been there for centuries, and unfortunately, any religion that comes from that region, or actually around the world, I suppose, as well, it's not just an Indian thing, has a similar sort of dichotomy between what men can do, talk about sex basically, and approach sex. But there isn't, in terms of the religion, no, there isn't a difference.
Thank you. So my final question is, do you think that sex and love have become important issues? Have they always been important issues to Sikhism or to other religions?
Yes, love a lot more so. Love is talked about as a ongoing and continuing theme throughout the poetry and the Holy Book. There's many love stories within the book itself. So love is absolutely essential to it all. And the Guru Granth Sahib itself has ceremonies that are taken, including the marriage ceremony that are written, and it's all about love and relationships. But there isn't, again, a massive amount basically written about, explicitly about sex. It is unfortunate because in a sense that the less talked about it, basically it becomes something that's behind closed doors. And it's certainly not something about the Holy Book itself, it's just about cultural again. Because India in the past had been so open about sex, so there are temples carved with sexual imagery and figures, and it was the place where the Kama Sutra came from. Basically, it's for centuries before, basically, India was really quite open to everything. And it's unfortunate it was actually the British who came in and decided that was too filthy, basically, and covered it all up. And the sort of the attitudes that India has now follows on from the East India Company and the invasion, basically, many centuries ago now. But before that, basically, was a lot more open, and sex was just part of life. In a few centuries' time, basically, that'll come back, basically, but it will take a very long time.
Thank you so much, Cully, for teaching us more about Sikhism. I, for one, must admit I knew very little before, and it is interesting to note the differences between this and Christianity. Moving back once again to the Abrahamic faiths, I wanted to find out more about Judaism. The head of the Jewish Society at St. Andrews University, where Spectrum is based, kindly agreed to be interviewed by us and tell us more about his faith.
I'm Joel, hi, and I'm a Reformed Jew, which is different to Orthodox Judaism. It comes from the Enlightenment, when new ideas were circulating, when Jewish people were getting more rights, and it kind of doesn't take the traditional text, the Torah, literally. It looks at it more critically and brings in more contemporary values into the religion.
What are the central texts, the central holy texts within your faith?
The Bible, the Torah, which is what some people would call the Old Testament.
And then there are two texts that help critically evaluate that, is that right?
Yeah, so you have more explanatory texts, which are also about 2,000 years old. The main one's the Talmud. The way it's set up is it's got like a central text in the middle, which is like maybe a quote from the Torah or something. And then you'll have different rabbis around the outside sort of arguing about it. And because it's such an old text, it's so huge. It was created over a few hundred years. So you have rabbis from different generations arguing with each other over these different things, which kind of sets up the foundations of Judaism, which is that you get two Jews in a room and you have three opinions.
What is the Torah's stance on sex?
Torah is an interesting stance on sex. It doesn't really have a word for it in Hebrew. It mainly uses euphemisms or idioms. So, for example, in the creation story, but when it says that Adam and Eve do things, I can't remember what the word is, but it doesn't explicitly say it.
So it's almost looked over in a way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty much.
But I mean, the idea would be sex between a man and a woman. Is that the traditional?
Pretty much, yeah.
And does Reformed Judaism, is it possible to challenge that in any way?
Very much so. Because the way Reformed Judaism looks at the Bible is that it's divinely inspired, it's influenced by the divine, but it's not written and dictated by God. It was codified by humans and therefore subject to mistakes, subject to context of the time, including the values they had, such as things like specific gender roles and attitude to gay people and that sort of thing.
So it is possible to look at it like outside of a heteronormative perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
So things like gay marriage, what's the kind of current stance?
Well, in Reformed Judaism, it's very positive. So my synagogue today is having their first gay wedding in the UK, which is very exciting. that kind of reflects the values of Reformed Judaism overall, which is that love is kind of a universal thing. It's not strictly related to man and a woman.
You brought up love. What's the kind of stance on that, or the stance on marriage, if that's an easier question?
Marriage is interesting. It's like most things, it depends on which group you're talking about. So if you're talking about Orthodox Jews, then specifically it can only refer to a man and a woman. Reformed Jews, it can be between a woman and a woman, or a man and a man, or a man and a woman.
Are there quite clearly differentiated gender roles in Orthodox Judaism?
Yeah, pretty much. For example, if you look at the traditional text, it's very clear what a woman's role is in the Bible. Specifically in the rabbinic law, when the rules were sort of codified and clarified, praying times given to women are much more flexible to reflect the fact that they're looking after the kids and looking after the house, and so will be busy and need to be more flexible. Whereas for men, the times they have to pray are very strict because that's what they're more able to do.
And what about the setup of the synagogue as well? Does that reflect any gender differences?
In Orthodox Judaism, so you'll have a gender split between men and women to prevent any hanky-panky in prayer. So the men will be doing the public prayer, they'll be allowed to handle the Bible, the Torah, which is the scroll, and women won't be allowed to do any sort of organisational thing. They'll be in the women's section, or which could be behind or next to or on top, but they won't have access to the sort of main prayer materials.
But it sounds like there's a lot of progression. You were saying Reformed Judaism has grown out of the Enlightenment period? Yeah.
Well, it depends on the movement. So I would identify three main movements. So you have ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Judaism, which I think most people would consider like stereotypical Jews. You know, they have the big black hats and everything. And they're the very traditional ones. I think the gender roles there are the most defined. Then you have Reformed Judaism, which I'm part of, which is very much like what we'd see today, where public life and religious life are very similar. Women can publicly lead prayer, they can be rabbis, they can be chairwomen of the shul, they can do all those sorts of things, they can sit with men and women, it's equal. Then you have Orthodox Judaism, or modern Orthodox Judaism, which is a counter to the Reform movement, but they split it between public life and religious life. So in public life, women can go out and work, and so in that sense they really embrace the Enlightenment. But because they view the religion as a continuous thing, and you have to hold strong to the tradition because it's the divine, what had been practiced for hundreds of years had to be maintained. So that's why in a near-Orthodox shul, you'll see very similar patterns.
Do you think when looking at those kind of strict patterns and the gender roles and everything, is there a difference in the way sex and love is looked at, whether it's a man or a woman? Is it stricter for women in any way or stricter for men?
It's difficult to say. It's interesting because in the Bible, you can have, like Abraham had more than one wife, which I think is quite telling. But then it also goes on to say that you can only have one wife. So that's quite interesting and maybe reflects something about what the religion believes. But I don't know if it's stricter for women or for men in terms of their roles, because the whole point of Judaism is that your life is strictly regulated. Every aspect of what you do is meant to have a purpose, is meant to be religious because you're doing God's work. A man and a woman both have different but equally stringent obligations from an Orthodox perspective.
But it sounds like there's a lot of progress within Reformed Judaism as well.
Yeah, I think so. There's a shift away from the hugely ritualistic way that people act into an element of individual choice. Autonomy is seen as being very important, informed decision making. It's up to you what you want to do religiously. It's up to me if I want to light the Shabbat candles. It's up to me if I want to get married in a certain way.
Within the Torah, is there a male focus on sexuality?
I mean, I think the majority of the people that it talks about in the Torah are men. All the characters are. A lot of the laws do relate to men. For example, with masturbation, with laws to do with gays, for example. It only talks about a man lying with another man. It doesn't ever reference a woman lying with a woman. And so the way that Orthodox Judaism deals with that is that lesbians probably... It's less of an issue, at least privately, I think, because gays are explicitly mentioned. That's quite a big difference. I don't think that means that women are ignored. I think it just shows that, at least in the Bible, men are seen as being more public and therefore more open to scrutiny from God.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Is there anything else that you want to add in?
I don't think so. I just think that it's a very interesting way to see how gender is conceived within the different movements. So in Orthodox Judaism, there is that very big split between genders, and it's a more separate but equal ideology, whereas Progressive Judaism is very different. They recognise the androgynous nature of human nature.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time.
You're most welcome.
Thank you, Joel, for being such a wonderful interview. It seems that there has been a great deal of change within Judaism over time, and it is interesting to think that there are such huge differences within as well as between different religions. This certainly seems to be true within Hinduism, which my next interviewee, B, will share her perspective of. B is a researcher for the BBC and has been brought up within a liberal Hindu faith. Unlike many Hindus, the idea of arranged marriage has not been something she has had to face. However, several of my friends within the Hindu and Muslim faiths will have arranged marriages and speak very positively about this. They will still have a say in choosing their future partner, but they will come from within their own community, and the two families will often already have established connections. This is not to negate the potentially dangerous or damaging effects of arranged marriages, but they can often be very positive experiences. Sometimes non-Western traditions may be negatively stereotyped without a fuller understanding. I interviewed B to try and find out more about what an experience of Hinduism may be like. So, B, could you tell me a little bit about your faith and what are the central ideas or beliefs?
I was brought up a Hindu, not massively strictly. I come from quite a liberal Hindu family where we were taught that the principles of the religion, the key central ideas, but also to appreciate other faiths and other religions growing up in the UK. Central beliefs really are, well, karma is a big central tenement of Hinduism. What people's interpretation of karma is open to debate. The beliefs really centre around an individual's release from the cycle of birth and rebirth. So Buddhists will call it nirvana, Hindus call it moksha, which means release. Essentially, one of the key things is the fact that your body is quite separate to your soul. So your soul moves from one life to the next, and your body is essentially like clothing, which you discard. Your body is discarded after you die, and what dictates where you go in your next life is based on karma. How you behave, your actions or inactions in this life will affect your status in the next life.
And are there any central holy texts within Hinduism?
There's lots of texts. I mean, the interesting thing about Hinduism is there's not one author, there's not one key person. It's evolved over centuries and centuries, and initially, from what I understand, the kind of central books, which became books, were transmitted orally through the Brahmin caste, which is the highest caste, and these are eventually written down. But the central kind of texts are the Vedas, the Upanishads. One of the key sort of books that most people will read or certainly have in their household is the Bhagavad Gita, which comes from a bigger epic called the Mahabharata. There's also the Ramayana, which is its own story. These are sort of stories based in myth and legend. Whether people existed or not is open for debate, but most Hindus believe that these people did exist. The other interesting thing, can I just go back to something about central beliefs and ideas?
Yeah, please do.
So going back to the central beliefs and ideas, a lot of people sort of view Hinduism as having a multitude of comedy gods. We've got gods with elephant heads and gods with monkey faces and all this kind of stuff. Essentially, yes, you can believe in many gods, but the thing to keep in mind is that these gods are representations of one god or one entity. And all these hundreds of gods that we have in Hinduism are just sort of symbolic representations of a more central tenet. That's my interpretation, anyway.
So within these holy texts, these different opinions, is a stance taken on love? Does it stipulate rules about marriage or who you can marry?
There's a big distinction to be made between what became the norm culturally as opposed to what the religious sort of teachings say. So, for example, my interpretation is that you have certain duties in life. One of the duties in life is to be a householder, and that means basically to marry and have children and carry forth your race. Now, there were sort of things which stated, I don't know if they're in the texts per se, or whether these were sort of more cultural things, I'm not so knowledgeable about that, where people would marry within their own caste and how people's caste was defined was by how they were born. So what caste they were born into defined what role they undertook in life. So there's four castes, the Varnas as they're called. So the Brahmins, who are the sort of more literate people at the top of the sort of caste, and then there's the Kshatriyas, or the sort of more warrior class, and then there's the third class, which is the sort of more tradespeople, perhaps would fall under that, and then there's the lower caste, which is sort of people who conduct funerals and those kind of things. So I suppose they're considered more a bit of an underclass in current Indian situations. In terms of marriage and who one can marry, I think it was kind of, back in the day, it was kept people marrying within their caste. I know that's still observed in many parts of India. You can't really marry outside of your caste, but whether that's an actual scriptural requirement or not, I don't know.
And when it comes to gay marriage, are there laws or rules similarly strict within the community or within the religion?
Again, there needs to be a distinction made between cultural and religious. As far as I'm aware, there's nothing in any of the Hindu scriptures which kind of states that homosexuality is wrong. I don't really know in terms of where that came about. The Indian community has been affected by a series of, I suppose, invasions and colonialism over the years. So there was a big Muslim invasion, the Mughal Empire, which brought Islam to India, and the Islamic practices, which are more Abrahamic and more kind of defined as to how people should behave in terms of sexuality, marriage and things like that. And then after that, there was the Western colonialisation, so a British Victorian mentality, which was based on kind of a firm Christian doctrine, which has probably filtered down into how people perceive homosexuality and gay marriage and things like that today. So this is where it's important to distinguish between the scriptures and culture, because over the years, culturally, India's been affected quite dramatically by these sort of interventions from other countries and other faiths. Whereas, yeah, as far as I'm aware, in Hindu scripture, there's nothing that says anything against homosexuality. Because of the whole notion of release from birth and death, the thing to know is, because your soul's separate from the physical being, part of the way you get to the point of moksha, release from birth and death, is by controlling your physical tendencies, your urges and things like that. So that goes for gay people and straight people. It's irrelevant. So I think that again, that's my interpretation. So.
And when it comes to gender, is there a difference between men and women as regards who you can love, who you can marry? Is it stricter for either gender?
Again, I think this is another cultural thing, hang up, that's been imported. In Hinduism, there's a great tradition of the goddess, the Devis, which are quite strong representations of the female form. For every male god, there's an equivalent female god. So Shiva has a female consort, Parvati. So probably in ancient sort of practice Hinduism, there was probably more equality. Women were regarded very highly, and therefore I don't think there was such a thing as gender discrimination per se. Women certainly couldn't practice the scriptures. They couldn't be Brahmin scholars like men could. So there was definitely that gender difference there when it came to imparting the scriptures, imparting the holy knowledge. But it didn't mean that women weren't as equal in terms of day-to-day life and things like that. So I don't know about love and gender differences between people who can love and who can't love. I think it comes down to, again, the difference between what's prescribed for a Hindu, which is, yeah, to gain this release. Whether you're male or female, I don't think it really matters.
When it comes to sex, is it a similar idea? What stance does Hinduism take on sex? Can it be a good thing or a sin?
It's about controlling of your desires, and whether that's confined in a marriage or not, I don't know. It's about being able to resist temptation and all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, the Hindus, are notorious for the Kama Sutra. If you look at temple walls in South India and stuff like that, they're ordained with quite sexualized imagery. So I think pre kind of Mughal invasion, I think it might have been a much freer viewpoint. Post sort of Islamic and Christian interventions later on, I think this changed.
So you think Abrahamic faiths have in some way influenced Hinduism, affected it culturally?
I don't know if they've influenced Hinduism as per the Vedas and the Upanishads, because they were written thousands of years, hundreds of years before these other cultures came along. But I do think that it has ingrained a cultural... I think the Abrahamic religions have certainly had an impact culturally on how things are viewed, and they've put Hindu glasses almost on it, used that to interpret Hinduism. So it's almost backwards, if you see what I mean.
And final question, do you think with Hinduism, sex and love are important?
I think so. I mean, I think that the meeting of not just two bodies, of two souls, and you become a partnership, like you do in every religion that prescribes marriage. I think that love is something that isn't just about your partner, it's about loving your family, it's about loving the different types of love. But you know what I mean, like, you're not going to love your granddad in the same way you love your boyfriend. It's a different type of love. What is kind of important in Hinduism is the fulfillment of your duty in these relationships. So yes, I think Hinduism speaks about love in different ways, but it does come down to your duty as a human, how you interpret your relationships based on love.
Thank you, B, for sharing your experiences with us. There are many similarities and differences between these four faiths. To try and tie it all together, I interviewed Gary from the BBC Department of Religion and Ethics. Although he comes from a Christian perspective himself, he is able to draw points of comparison between different faith groups when it comes to the central ideas of sex and love. So, Gary, where do you work at the moment?
For the last 20 years, I've worked for BBC Religion and Ethics. I mostly work on songs of praise, and I must emphasise that I'm speaking personally as somebody from a liberal Christian perspective, not as a spokesperson for the BBC or BBC Religion and Ethics.
Do you think that different religions have a shared morality to any extent?
I think they do. I think they certainly have a view towards the sanctity of life, certainly sanctity of human life. I think that the Ten Commandments are a sort of core text of Christianity and Judaism, and I think, certainly in regards of property and things like that, there is a great deal in common, and I would imagine that they gave the basis of law for many societies throughout the world.
In your experience of different religions, do they take a stance on the issue of sex and love?
They do. I mean, it's probably one of the things that religions get most hung up about, really. You only have to look at the sort of tribulations that the Anglican Church ties itself in, for instance, with the issue of homosexuality and same-sex marriage. So clearly they do take a very strong stance on that, yes.
Are there any similarities between different scriptures' views on sex and love?
Well, the main Abrahamic faiths, particularly Christianity and Judaism, obviously share the same religious text to some extent. The Torah in Judaism, the Old Testament in Christianity, and there you've got the Ten Commandments, and clearly there are tenets there about adultery and same-sex relationships, etc., that are very much fundamental to Christianity and Judaism, certainly.
Why do you think that sex and love are issues that have become so important to all the faith groups?
Well, I think they always have been important to them, really. There's been a sense of moral control that the Church has endeavoured to impose to a certain extent, but also I think they are just such central issues to human beings, really, that religion is almost bound to encompass them, really, and want to bring its influence to bear on matters of sex and love.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this episode from Spectrum. Researching this has certainly taught me a lot, but the two main things I have learnt from this are that, firstly, there are as many differences within faiths as there are between them, and, secondly, there are huge differences between the culture around a particular religion and the religion itself. It seems clear that sex and love are important issues to many faiths. Where they have been affected by gender, this seems to be more because of history and culture than the core beliefs of the faiths themselves. What are your own views on sex and love? Have they been shaped by your religion or your gender? Find us on Facebook, Twitter, or our blog to stay in touch with Spectrum, and please stay tuned for more episodes on sex and love. Thank you.